British television comedy has produced many legendary moments, but few have sparked as much controversy as the scene that nearly ended Fawlty Towers before its time. The year was 1975, and BBC audiences were still adjusting to the frantic energy of John Cleese's hotel-based sitcom. Little did anyone know that a single episode would trigger a firestorm of complaints, internal BBC debates, and ultimately, the temporary removal of the show from broadcast schedules. The episode in question? The Germans. And within it, one particular sequence that crossed every line British television had carefully constructed. To understand why this scene caused such an uproar, we must first examine the climate of 1970s British television. The BBC operated under strict guidelines about taste and decency, particularly regarding depictions of World War II. Just 30 years had passed since the war's end, and many viewers still carried fresh memories of loss and trauma. Comedy about Nazi Germany was virtually unheard of. According to BBC archives from the period, network executives maintained an unwritten rule: Hitler jokes were off limits, and any reference to the war required careful handling. John Cleese knew these rules existed. He simply chose to ignore them. The scene itself unfolds with perfect comedic tension. Basil Fawlty, having suffered a concussion from hitting his head on a beam, stumbles through his duties while a group of German tourists checks into the hotel. His well-meaning but increasingly unhinged staff try to keep him away from the guests. The famous line, "Don't mention the war," becomes a running gag. But then comes the moment that changed everything. Basil, in his concussed state, launches into a rambling monologue about British wartime superiority, complete with a goose-stepping march and a raised arm salute that unmistakably mimics Adolf Hitler. The studio audience gasped. Then they laughed. But millions watching at home did not find it funny at all. What made the scene particularly explosive was its timing. The episode aired on October 24, 1975, less than 3 decades after the liberation of Auschwitz. Many British families had lost relatives in the conflict. German viewers, of which the BBC had a growing international audience, expressed outrage that their country's darkest chapter was being reduced to slapstick comedy. Letters poured into BBC headquarters at a rate that executives had never seen for a sitcom. One particularly angry correspondent wrote, "My husband died fighting men like the one Mr. Cleese is mocking. This is not entertainment, this is a disgrace." The BBC switchboard reportedly received over 500 calls within 24 hours of the broadcast. Behind the scenes, panic set in. BBC Director of Programs Alastair Milne faced an impossible decision. The show was popular, but the complaints were mounting. According to internal memos later released from the BBC Written Archive Centre, Milne seriously considered pulling Fawlty Towers from the air entirely. The German embassy has formally expressed concern. One memo read, "We must decide whether this episode can ever be repeated." For 2 weeks, the fate of the entire series hung in the balance. Cleese, characteristically defiant, refused to apologize. He argued that the joke was not on the Germans but on Basil's absurd Britishness and his inability to move past wartime thinking. The controversy did not stop at complaints. Political pressure soon followed. Several members of Parliament raised questions about BBC funding and whether public money should support programming that could damage British relations with Germany. The Conservative MP for Wolverhampton South West, Nicholas Budgeon, called the episode a diplomatic embarrassment. Meanwhile, the German ambassador to the United Kingdom, Hans-Helmuth Ruet, issued a carefully worded statement expressing disappointment that British television would trivialize the suffering caused by Nazi aggression. The BBC found itself caught between defending artistic expression and maintaining international goodwill. What happened next surprised everyone. Rather than cancel the show, the BBC decided to shelve The Germans indefinitely. The episode was removed from all future broadcast schedules. For nearly 3 years, viewers could not see the controversial scene unless they had recorded it themselves on the emerging home video technology. Fawlty Towers continued airing its other 11 episodes, but the missing episode became legendary. Fans wrote letters demanding its return. Critics, who had initially condemned the scene, began to reconsider, arguing that removal amounted to censorship. The controversy had inadvertently made the episode more famous than if it had aired without incident. John Cleese used the hiatus to refine his defense of the scene. In numerous interviews during 1976 and 1977, he explained the satirical intent behind the goose step sequence. "Basil is not a Nazi sympathizer," Cleese told The Guardian. "He is a fool, a complete idiot, who thinks he is being sophisticated, but reveals his own ignorance with every word. The joke is on him, not on Germany." This distinction mattered enormously in the debate. Cleese understood that satire requires a target, and his target was never the German people but rather the British obsession with the war and the awkwardness that surrounded German-British relations in the post-war era. The tide began to turn when prominent voices defended the episode. The playwright and critic Dennis Potter wrote a column arguing that removing the scene does more damage to memory than the scene itself ever could. Potter suggested that pretending the war had not happened, or that its imagery was too sacred for comedy, actually weakened the lessons learned from history. Other cultural figures joined the defense, including the historian A.J.P. Taylor, who noted that Hitler himself would have appreciated the absurdity of a concussed hotel manager trying to goose-step while wearing a suit and carrying a frying pan. Slowly, the conversation shifted from outrage to analysis. In 1978, the BBC quietly reinstated the Germans to the Fawlty Towers rotation. No formal announcement was made, no apology was issued. The episode simply reappeared in the schedules as if nothing had happened, but the damage to the show's reputation had already been done, or perhaps the damage had been transformed into legend. Viewers tuned in specifically to see what all the fuss was about. The episode became the most watched of the entire series. A new generation discovered Fawlty Towers precisely because of the controversy that had nearly killed it. The long-term impact of the scene cannot be overstated. It established Fawlty Towers as a show that refused to play it safe, a quality that would define its legacy. When the British Film Institute named Fawlty Towers the greatest British television series of all time in 2000, critics specifically cited the Germans as evidence of the show's daring. The scene had transformed from a liability into a badge of honor. According to BFI curator Dick Fitty, the controversy actually proved the show's point. Basil's awkwardness around the German guests was a mirror held up to British society. People were angry because they recognized themselves. Yet the story does not end there. In recent years, the scene has faced new scrutiny in the age of streaming. When the UKTV network aired reruns in 2020, executives chose to edit out the goose step sequence entirely. The decision sparked a fresh round of debate. John Cleese, now in his 80s, took to Twitter to express his fury. "Cowards," he wrote. "The joke is and always was on Basil's stupidity. Removing it proves you don't understand satire." The edited version lasted only 2 weeks before public pressure forced UKTV to restore the original cut. Once again, the scene had survived an attempt to bury it. What makes this particular moment in television history so enduring? Perhaps it is the uncomfortable truth at its core. The scene works because it reveals something real about how societies process trauma. Comedy, at its best, allows people to confront painful subjects from a safe distance. Basil Fawlty's goose step is not a celebration of evil, but a demonstration of how foolish evil looks when imitated by a foolish man. The controversy was never really about the scene itself, but about whether television had the right to make that artistic choice. History has largely answered that question in Cleese's favor. The legacy of the Germans extends far beyond Fawlty Towers. It established a template for boundary-pushing comedy that influenced shows like Brass Eye, The Day Today, and even international hits like Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm. Every time a sitcom dares to touch a sensitive subject, it walks a path that Cleese first cleared with a frying pan and a bad German accent. The scene that nearly took Fawlty Towers off the air ultimately secured its place in history, proving that sometimes the most dangerous jokes are the ones worth telling, and somewhere, Basil Fawlty is probably still goose-stepping through the BBC archives, blissfully unaware that he won the argument decades ago.